and manage the podcasts and the content that are distributed on their platform, which is a scary combination with how quickly they are becoming a very powerful player in the podcasting industry. So they're buying a lot of content and pushing a lot of people into podcast content for the reasons that you guys mentioned earlier. Like the licensing fees on it are much lower, so they make a lot more money the more time people spend on their platform listening to podcast content versus music. And they're just investing a ton of money in growing the podcasting side of their business and now moving into the video side as well. But it becomes scary, right? Because if they don't like what you're talking about, they can kick you off your platform. So if you build your whole audience around what Spotify is doing, there's a huge risk there, right? Like that you could get, I mean, in the YouTube world, they call it like demonetized, but Spotify is not really monetizing anybody yet. They just will boot you. And so that's concerning.
Yeah. And beyond like some sort of censorship concerns, there's also when there is a platform and it's YouTube is the platform for video online, everything runs through the lens of, is this good for YouTube? And so when it's, hey, do we serve up tons of ads in front of the videos? The only thing they're really thinking through is this good for YouTube? They're not saying, hey, is PewDiePie happy with me serving up these ads this way? Even their top creators, that's not who they're stressed out about. They're stressed out about YouTube. And if we consolidate the entire podcasting industry into a platform, then the podcasting industry is subservient to that platform. It serves the interests of that platform. And so Spotify will be able to make decisions that are not based on, hey, how do we keep a vibrant ecosystem of, different business models and different ways for people to make money and different ways for the industry to grow and develop. They're going to go, well, what right now makes the most sense for Spotify? You just think of how much diversity there is in written content online that's just built on top of the web browser and HTTP, how different that is from something like YouTube or social media that are built for platforms and for their interests.
Yeah. And then you couple that with the news that was not so far in the distant past, where they rolled out their brand new dynamic ad dashboard for podcasting, right? And so you can start to see all these pieces come together where they're not only trying to get exclusive rights to some of the bigger podcasts in the world to try and drive new people to sign up for Spotify and choose Spotify as their primary podcast listening app. But then they also want to get on the ad revenue side. They want to become the middleman for all the ad revenue in podcasting. And so if you want to advertise, at least right now, Joe Rogan is maintaining his existing ad strategy of doing host-read ads and getting sponsors that way. But you could totally see in the not too distant future, Spotify says, you know what? You're now using our dynamic ad platform and we're taking a 30% cut because that's the cost of playing on Spotify. That makes sense for Spotify. If they have all of this attention and all of this traffic and all these people listening to podcast episodes, and they have the ability to dynamically target and insert ads to try and get you to spend money so that they can make money, that is a win for Spotify, even at the expense of the entire podcasting ecosystem.
Yeah, and that is the only way that this deal makes sense for Spotify. I think it's good to go back to Kevin's example with Howard Stern and Sirius XM, that when he signed that deal, the whole thing that was in it for Sirius was, hey, nobody really is doing this whole listening to, online, whatever, satellite radio. But maybe if we bring the million people, which is about what it was, who listen to Howard Stern every day and make them buy this extra hardware and set up this up and get a subscription, then maybe we'll start having a viable business model because we will bring all that together. And after they did that was when I think they merged with XM, and then they had one single platform. Spotify wants to do that. They're not buying Joe Rogan for hundreds of millions of dollars because they think, hey, the 11 million downloads he gets are going to make us so much money in ads that we actually will make out on this deal. They're not doing that. They are saying we're going to move the 11 million people that listen to Joe every month off of another platform onto Spotify. And then when this deal runs out in 4 years or whatever it will be, they will still be here. And if Joe moves back to his old host and his old feed, even then when he's doing that, they will still stay on Spotify. And then they will have the ability to run dynamic ads around the podcast. And, that way they're able to bring everything together.
Yeah.
So the only way it makes sense for them is if their goal is to try to win, and they're trying to win so that they can be the middleman brokering all the ad deals in the podcasting space and all the content in the podcasting space.
Yeah. What happens when these platforms come in and put themselves as a middleman or like a gatekeeper between the content that you want to consume and the actual consumer is that the content becomes very devalued because they start to learn who's interested in listening to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, right? And then even if that podcast leaves, we still know all the people that match the demographic profile for listening to that show, and they're listening to other shows or they're listening to other music. So we can still target them the same way. So if an advertiser is willing to pay $30 or $40 CPM to advertise on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, it's not the message that Joe's delivering that the advertisers are interested in. It's the demographic profile of the person who's listening to that. And as long as Spotify has the data to be able to target those same people, even if they're listening to different shows, they can sell that same ad at that same CPM to target the same people, even if they're listening to different shows. It's the exact same thing that Google has done and Facebook has done. I mean, Facebook and Google are ad businesses, right? And if we look back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when independent blogging was exploding, and there was lots of independent publishers like newspapers and, journalists who were doing private blogs and stuff, they were creating this amazing content, and they were either selling their own ads or there were these independent ad networks that would sell ads on behalf of multiple blogs, right? That's very similar to what we have in the podcasting space right now. We might create content, we put it out on a podcast host, it gets distributed, and then we can work ourselves. We can work affiliate deals, we can contact advertisers who we think might be a good fit for our show, or we can partner up with companies like, Midroll or Art19 or somebody who would sell ads just based on like the number of downloads that we get or specific information about our show, and then they take a cut. But there's these different silos of people who work in these independent spaces in the podcasting industry, and it's exactly what it looked like in the early 2000s with blogging. Then Facebook comes along and Google comes along, and they start saying, hey, why are you spending $5,000 on that ad on the New York Times website when I can target the same exact people for you and sell it to you for $1 a click? Wouldn't that be better? And people are like, yeah, I don't want to spend $5,000 for that ad if I can just pay you $1 a click. That is what has kind of destroyed independent blogs and the whole advertising space around independent content websites, like in the blogging world. All those people now consume content on Facebook and they find it through Google, and those people have taken all the revenue. So the people who create the content are not getting the value out of it that they used to. They used to be able to get paid for their work, and they really don't anymore. They get paid pennies on the dollar. Who gets all the money? Facebook, Instagram, well, they're the same company, Google. Yeah, it's like these conglomerates that come together and they say it's not, their models devalue the content and devalue the content creator, because at the end of the day, all that content is doing is attracting certain people. And if somebody comes along and says, I can target those same people for you for a lot less money, then where are the advertisers going to spend their money? With the people who can get the same ad in front of those same people for less.
Right. And we're not against dynamically inserted or a dynamic insertion technology. It's actually really cool the way it works. The reason that we discourage it so much for podcasters is the math never works out in your favor. Like ever. I have never seen a scenario where someone made more money doing dynamically inserted ads, especially if a third-party service is taking a cut of that, versus if you found your own sponsors, promoted affiliates that you believed in, sold your own products, created a subscription membership like Patreon. There are so many other ways to make more money. There is not a single podcast in the universe that benefits from dynamically inserted ads, apart from, I just don't want to lift a finger to try and figure this out. You figure it out and just give me whatever nickels are left over.
Right. And here's how it ties back to Spotify, is that we don't know exactly what deal Joe signed with Spotify, right? He might very well still do host-read ads. He might still be able to sell his own ads outside of Spotify's ad network, or he may not. He may have signed that away. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that at the end of the day, Spotify determined whatever they inked on paper to be valuable enough because they need to draw more podcast listeners into the Spotify podcasting app. As soon as they get, well, not as soon as, the more listeners they get, the more clout that they get, the more that they connect in people's minds, the idea that when I hear the word podcasting, I think Spotify, the more power that they get, right? And so then they get to curate shows. They get to say who's in and who's out. They get to say how much ads cost on podcasts, whether they be host-read or dynamically inserted. Doesn't really matter. Again, Apple has had a scary amount of power in this place for a long time, but never did anything super concerning. So it's not like, I don't want to feel like we're just picking on Spotify. What we're picking on is that they are moving into a very powerful position. They have been for the last 1.5 to 2 years. And all the evidence of the moves that they're making don't look like a pretty happy future. They look like what Facebook looks like. They look like what YouTube looks like. And that's not great for the independent content creators because we've seen what these platforms do. We've seen how Facebook has completely decimated the blogging ecosystem. We see that YouTube has decimated the online video ecosystem. In terms of the number of creators who actually get compensated fairly for the content that they provide to this platform, it's nothing. It's nothing. There are very few YouTubers that are actually making a good, healthy living off of just the revenue that they generate straight from the platform. But if you look at like Google stock, they're doing great. Look at Facebook stock. They're killing it. So somebody's winning here and somebody's losing. And somebody's doing a whole bunch of work, but creating all this content. And that's the independent creator. And so I think it's worth thinking about. The question becomes like, well, what do we do about it as independent podcasters? And I think Joe Rogan, ironically enough, has already given us the answer. Joe Rogan, the guy who's just made more money from Spotify than probably anybody in the history of Spotify, never had his shows on Spotify. He withheld his content. And he said, no, I don't like the way that you guys treat independent podcasters and artists and you don't pay them well and all this kind of stuff. And he held out. He held his content off of there, built his audience independently, used JRE clips on Facebook, and then posted his own podcast audio through an independent podcast host and distributed it to third-party apps and did it that way. And he just got the dump truck full of money. And so I think if you throw your show in there, you're just another, I've said this before, you're another pebble on the pile of giving Spotify the power that they want to win the podcasting space. And none of us should try to win an open, healthy, vibrant ecosystem. We should all figure out how do we encourage the growth of openness and keep it open and keep it healthy. As soon as somebody tries to win, like that's the opposite of open. They're going to control it. They're going to close it down. It's going to be a walled garden and you're going to have to play by their rules. That doesn't sound, that sounds like what happened to blogs and when Facebook came in and crushed them all.
So before we shift gears, I want to park on that a little bit as far as seriously considering pulling your content off of Spotify. How would you do that? Let's say that you have 30% of your audience on Spotify right now, and the idea that you're just going to shut that off is can certainly give you some anxiety. If I'm just going to choose to take a moral stand here and lose 30% of my listening audience.
Well, it's not moral. It's a principled stand. And I think everyone should just make their own decision. This is I'm speaking a lot. This is my opinions. Albin and Travis share some of these same opinions. But we haven't had any of the Buzzsprout produced podcasts on Spotify for quite a while. We didn't have them on in the beginning, and then they switched to pass-through, and we said, okay, we'll give you a shot. And then they launched this whole, ad targeting campaign, and we're touting it, and we're like, we don't want our people who are listening to our shows targeted and profiled, so we pulled it back out. Now they're doing the stuff with Jerry. Again, I don't fault them for making smart business moves. And if I was a shareholder, I would be very happy because these are smart business moves. But these are business moves that are in the best interest of shareholders, not necessarily, my belief, independent podcasters. And so I get it. There's always a cost for doing something. Like if you agree on principle that what Spotify's doing